They were laughing and shoving each other like any group of 20-year-olds, until the youngest one saw the faded patch on her jacket sleeve, and his face went white. The September sun hung low over the Rocky Mountains, casting long shadows across the gleaming marble expanse of the terrazzo. 5 cadets stood in a loose circle near the base of the chapel's 17 spires, their crisp blue uniforms still holding their morning starch despite a full day of classes and drills. It was that golden hour between the end of academic obligations and the beginning of evening formation, when the rigid structure of academy life relaxed just enough to let these young men and women remember they were still barely out of their teenage years. Cadet third-class Marcus Chen leaned back against the stone wall, his arms crossed over his chest as he grinned at something Cadet Jake Morrison had just said. Morrison, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that came from growing up as the captain of every team he'd ever joined, was in the middle of an animated story about his first solo flight in a T-6 Texan II trainer aircraft. His hands moved through the air, banking and diving as he recreated every maneuver. "I'm telling you, the IP barely had to touch the controls," Morrison said, using the shorthand for instructor pilot. 3 weeks from now, they're going to have to drag me out of the cockpit. I was born for this." Cadet Sarah Rodriguez rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. "Morrison, you threw up in a trash can after your first centrifuge training. Don't act like you're Chuck Yeager." The group erupted in laughter. Cadet David Park doubled over, slapping his knee. "Oh man, I forgot about that. You were green for like 3 hours." Morrison's face flushed, but he laughed along with them. That was different. The G-forces in that thing are insane. But actual flying? That's where I belong. 10 years from now, I'll be flying F-35s off carriers, and you'll all be— "The Air Force doesn't fly off carriers, genius," interrupted Cadet Emma Walsh, the only one in the group who'd grown up in a military family. Her father had been a Navy pilot, and she never missed a chance to remind Morrison of his occasional gaps in military knowledge. "That's the Navy. You know, the people who actually know what they're doing." More laughter. Morrison threw up his hands in mock surrender. Okay, fine. I'll be flying F-35s off of land. Happy?" Chen pushed off from the wall, checking his watch. "We've got 40 minutes until formation. Anyone want to grab something from the C-store?" "I'm in," Park said. "I need caffeine if I'm going to make it through Aero tonight." And they started walking across the terrazzo, their formation casual now, no longer the rigid march of official movements. Around them, other cadets moved in similar groups, some still in uniform, others changed into athletic gear for intramural sports. The massive campus sprawled in every direction, a monument to precision and purpose built into the foothills of the Rockies. Rodriguez nudged Walsh. "You going to the Heritage Dinner on Friday?" Walsh shrugged. "I don't know. My dad said there are going to be a bunch of old pilots there telling war stories. Might be interesting. Might be them talking about how much better everything was in their day." "Your dad's going to be there though, right?" Chen asked. "Yeah, he wouldn't miss it. He loves this stuff. Gets to see all his buddies from his squadron days, relive the glory years." Walsh's voice held affection despite the gentle teasing. "I swear, sometimes I think he wishes he could still be flying combat missions instead of sitting behind a desk at the Pentagon." Morrison jumped back into the conversation. "That's gonna be us someday. 20 years from now, we'll be the ones boring young cadets with stories about our missions." "You gotta fly the missions first, Jake," Park said dryly. They were still laughing when they rounded the corner near Fairchild Hall, the academic building where most of their classes took place. The late afternoon light painted everything gold and amber, and the air carried that crisp bite that comes to the high country even in early fall. That's when they saw her. She walked alone, coming from the direction of the visitor parking lot, and she didn't look like she belonged. Not here, not on this campus where every person moved with purpose and precision, where uniforms were spotless and bearing was everything. She looked like someone's mom, maybe, or an aunt. Mid-50s, perhaps older, though she moved with an ease that suggested she kept herself in shape. Her jeans were faded, her boots scuffed leather. Her hair, more grey than brown, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. But it was the jacket that caught Chen's attention first, even before the patch. She wore a sage-green flight jacket, the kind that looked like it had seen decades of use. The material was worn soft, the cuffs frayed, the colour faded in patches from sun and time. It hung on her frame like an old friend, comfortable and familiar, the kind of jacket that didn't come from a surplus store or a costume shop, the kind of jacket that had stories embedded in every thread. Morrison noticed her too, but his reaction was different. He lowered his voice, though not quite enough. "What's with civilians wearing flight jackets? You can buy those things anywhere now. Probably got it at some vintage store." Walsh shot him a look. "Jake, come on." "What?" "I'm just saying, it's weird when people wear military gear without earning it." The woman was closer now, maybe 20 feet away, walking parallel to them along the edge of the terrazzo. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes on the distant mountains, not paying attention to the cluster of cadets. There was something about her posture, something in the way she carried herself that didn't quite match the casual civilian appearance. Rodriguez, always the most diplomatic of the group, said quietly, "Maybe it was her husband's, or her son's. Could be a family thing." "Maybe," Morrison said, but he didn't sound convinced. They kept walking, their conversation drifting to other topics. Park was talking about an upcoming exam in thermodynamics, and Walsh was complaining about the 10-mile ruck march scheduled for Saturday morning. Normal cadet concerns, the daily pressures of transforming from civilian teenagers into military officers. The woman passed within 10 feet of them, heading toward the chapel. She glanced over briefly, offered a small nod of acknowledgement, the kind of polite gesture any visitor might give to uniformed cadets, and continued on her way. That should have been the end of it. But Chen, the quietest of the group, the one who usually listened more than he talked, had seen something. As the woman passed, the angle of the late afternoon sun hit her jacket just right, and for a moment, everything on her left shoulder became clearly visible. His eyes locked onto the patch sewn just below the shoulder seam. He stopped walking. The blood drained from his face. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He stood frozen on the terrazzo, staring after the woman as she continued her unhurried walk toward the chapel's entrance. Park noticed first. "Chen, you okay, man?" Chen didn't respond. His eyes were still fixed on the woman's retreating back, specifically on that jacket, on that patch that the others hadn't really looked at. Morrison turned around, walking backward now. "Dude, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Still, Chen couldn't seem to form words. His hand came up slowly, pointing at the woman who was now 30 feet away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and it shook. "Do you see that patch?" The other 4 cadets stopped now, turning to look where Chen was pointing. The woman was still visible, still walking slowly, still seemingly unaware of the attention she'd suddenly drawn. Walsh squinted. "What about it?" Chen's hand was trembling. His face had gone from white to almost grey. When he spoke again, his voice cracked. "That's a 388th Tactical Fighter Wing patch, with combat designations." There was a beat of silence. Morrison frowned. "So, could be a replica. People collect those things." But Chen was shaking his head, and now he was moving forward, taking quick steps to close the distance with the woman. His voice came out louder than he intended, urgent and disbelieving. "Ma'am? Excuse me, ma'am?" The woman stopped, turned. Her face showed polite curiosity, maybe a little confusion at being approached by a cadet who looked like he'd just witnessed a miracle or a catastrophe. He himself wasn't sure which. The other 4 cadets hurried to catch up, forming a loose semicircle. Chen stood in front, still staring at the patch, his eyes now scanning the rest of the jacket with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. Up close, they could all see what Chen had seen. The patch on her left shoulder was indeed from the 388th Tactical Fighter Wing. 2 swords crossed behind a shield, the design unmistakable. But beneath it were smaller patches, tabs and pins that told a more complex story. Combat mission markers, a Desert Storm campaign ribbon, service dates that made Rodriguez's breath catch. And on the right breast, partially hidden by the zipper, another patch. This one made Walsh audibly gasp. It was the Wild Weasel insignia. Chen's voice was steadier now, but still filled with an emotion none of them had heard from him before, something between awe and disbelief. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you, but that jacket, those patches, were you—" The woman looked down at her jacket, then back up at the 5 young faces staring at her. A small, almost sad smile crossed her features. She seemed to be weighing something, deciding how much to say, or whether to say anything at all. "It was a long time ago," she said finally. Her voice was gentle, with a slight rasp that might have been age or might have been something else. "Just old memories." Chen wasn't letting it go. His voice came out in a rush now, the words tumbling over each other. "The 388th flew F-16s out of Hill Air Force Base. Those combat tabs, the dates on them, that's Operation Desert Storm. And that Wild Weasel patch. Ma'am, those were the pilots who hunted surface-to-air missile sites, the most dangerous missions in the war." The woman's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in her eyes. A door opening slightly, or maybe closing. "Like I said, it was a long time ago." Morrison found his voice, and to his credit, all the bravado was gone. "Did you fly?" A pause. The wind picked up slightly, stirring the flags in the distance. "I did." Rodriguez stepped closer. "Combat missions?" "Yes." "Park," his voice hushed now. "How many?" The woman looked past them for a moment, toward the mountains, toward something none of them could see. "Enough." Walsh, who'd grown up around military pilots, who'd heard her father's stories her entire life, asked the question differently. Her voice held respect now, the kind that couldn't be faked. "Ma'am, what squadron were you with?" The woman met Walsh's eyes. In that moment, she seemed to be measuring something in the young cadet's face, deciding if these 5 were ready for the answer. She must have seen something she liked, or maybe she was just tired of deflecting. "I was with the 421st Tactical Fighter Squadron," she said quietly. "The Black Widows. We deployed to Al-Kaj Air Base in January 1991. Chen's legs almost gave out. He grabbed Morrison's arm to steady himself. The 421st. The Black Widows. Every cadet who'd studied air combat history knew that name. They'd been one of the most active squadrons in Desert Storm, flying Wild Weasel missions deep into Iraqi airspace, deliberately drawing fire from enemy SAM sites so other aircraft could strike without being shot down. And they'd lost pilots. Chen knew that. Everyone knew that. Morrison's voice came out hoarse. "You flew Wild Weasel missions into Baghdad?" The woman nodded once, sharp and precise, a pilot's nod. The 5 cadets stood in stunned silence. Around them, the academy continued its daily rhythm, other cadets walking to and from classes, staff cars driving past, the distant sound of drilling on the parade ground. But in this small circle, time seemed to have stopped. Rodriguez found her voice first. "Ma'am, we had no idea. How could you?" The woman's voice was kind, not defensive. "It's just an old jacket. Most people don't look twice." But Chen was still staring at the patches, cataloguing every detail with the focus of someone who'd spent countless hours studying military aviation history. "Those mission markers. Ma'am, there must be— How many missions did you fly?" The woman glanced down at her jacket again, as if seeing it for the first time in years. 43 combat missions, over Iraq and Kuwait, January through March of 91. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap. 43 missions. Park, whose dream was to fly combat aircraft, whose bedroom back home was covered in posters of F-16s and F-22s, literally took a step back. His voice came out in an awed whisper. That's more than most pilots fly in their entire careers now." The woman smiled again, but this time it carried weight. Different war, different time. Walsh, who'd been quiet, suddenly spoke up with new urgency. "Ma'am, what's your name?" The woman hesitated. For a moment it seemed like she might deflect again, might politely excuse herself and continue her walk to the chapel, leaving these 5 cadets with their shock and their questions. But then she seemed to make a decision. "Colonel Sarah Donovan," she said. "Retired, but you can call me Sarah." The name hit them like a physical force. Colonel Sarah Donovan. Chen's hand went to his mouth. Morrison's eyes went wide. Rodriguez actually took a step backward, nearly stumbling over her own feet. Walsh recovered first, snapping to attention so quickly her heels clicked against the marble. "Ma'am!" The word came out sharp and respectful, carrying across the terrazzo. The other 4 followed instantly, their bodies moving on instinct drilled into them through countless hours of training. 5 cadets at rigid attention, spines straight, eyes forward, showing the respect they'd failed to recognize just moments before. Donovan raised a hand gently. "At ease, please. I'm retired, and this isn't a formal setting. You don't need to—" "Ma'am, with respect," Walsh interrupted, her voice firm despite the emotion behind it. "Yes, we do." Around them, other cadets were starting to notice. Something about the tableau, 5 third-class cadets at attention in front of a woman in civilian clothes, drew curious glances. A pair of upperclassmen slowed their pace, watching. A captain walking toward Fairchild Hall paused mid-stride. Donovan looked at the 5 faces before her, saw the mix of shock and respect, and something else, perhaps shame at their earlier dismissiveness. Her expression softened. "Why don't we step over there?" She gestured toward a quieter section of the courtyard, away from the main flow of foot traffic. "And you can ask me whatever you'd like to know." They moved as a group, the cadets maintaining a respectful distance. When they reached the low wall overlooking the parade ground, Donovan leaned against it casually, but the 5 remained standing, unable to relax despite her informal demeanor. Chen spoke first, his voice still shaky. "Ma'am, we study your squadron in our air combat history class, the 421st, the Black Widows, but they never mentioned—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "That there was a woman flying with them?" Donovan finished for him, her tone matter-of-fact. "Yes, ma'am." Donovan nodded slowly, looking out across the parade ground, where afternoon shadows stretched long and thin. "There weren't many of us. Female combat pilots in 91. We were there, but we weren't the story the media wanted to tell. Not yet, anyway." Morrison had found his voice again, though all traces of his earlier cockiness had evaporated. "Ma'am, I apologize. Earlier, when you walked past, I heard what you said." Donovan's voice wasn't harsh, but it was direct. "You assumed the jacket was a costume, a prop, something I had no right to wear." Morrison's face flushed red. "Yes, ma'am, I was wrong. I'm sorry." "Were you wrong?" Donovan turned to face him fully now. "Or did you just not have enough information to make a proper assessment?" The question hung there, not quite rhetorical. Rodriguez jumped in. "Ma'am, I think what Morrison means is that we should have looked closer, should have paid attention before making assumptions." "That's a good lesson for a pilot," Donovan said. "The details matter. The things you don't notice can kill you." She tapped the wild weasel patch on her chest. "Especially in my line of work." Park couldn't contain himself any longer. "Ma'am, wild weasel missions, those were suicide runs. You deliberately flew into the most heavily defended airspace to get the SAM sites to light you up so they could be targeted. The loss rates were acceptable given the mission objectives," Donovan cut in, her voice taking on a different quality now. Harder, more distant. "We knew what we were signing up for. We knew the risks." Walsh, who'd been quiet since snapping to attention, spoke carefully. "My father flew F-14s in Desert Storm off the Eisenhower. He said the Wild Weasel pilots were either the bravest or the craziest people he'd ever met." A ghost of a smile crossed Donovan's face. "We preferred dedicated." She paused, then added, "What's your father's name?" "Commander Richard Walsh, ma'am. He's at the Pentagon now." "Dick Walsh?" Donovan's face lit up with recognition. "Tall guy?" Always told terrible jokes in the O Club? Walsh grinned despite herself. That's him, ma'am. Tell him Sarah Donovan says hello. We crossed paths a few times during the war. Good man, good stick. She used the pilot slang with the ease of someone who'd lived the life, not just studied it. The connection seemed to break something open. The conversation shifted from formal to something more genuine, though the respect in the cadets' voices never wavered. Chen, who'd been staring at the patches again, pointed to a small tab sewn near the elbow. Ma'am, that tab, that's a mission counter, isn't it? It is. But there are... Ma'am, I can count at least 15 individual mission markers just on that sleeve alone. Donovan looked down at the jacket, running her hand over the faded fabric. 43 total. Like I said, we flew constantly in those first weeks. Sometimes 2 missions a day when the tempo was high. Morrison's voice came out quiet, almost afraid of the answer. What was it like, flying into Baghdad's air defenses? Donovan was silent for a long moment. The wind picked up again, carrying the sound of a bugle from somewhere across the vast campus. When she spoke, her voice was measured, choosing each word carefully. Terrifying, exhilarating, necessary. She met Morrison's eyes. You train for years to do the job. You study the tactics, practice the maneuvers, memorize the procedures. But when you're actually there, when the threat receiver is screaming in your headset and you can see the SAM launches tracking toward you, everything changes. Training keeps you alive, but something else gets you through it. What, ma'am? Park asked. The people beside you. Your wingman, your squadron. You're not doing it for glory or medals or to prove anything. You're doing it because 20 other pilots are counting on you to take out those SAM sites so they can complete their missions and make it home. You're doing it because if you don't, people die. The 5 cadets absorbed this in silence. These were the words of someone who'd actually done what they were only training to do. Someone who'd faced the reality they could only imagine. Rodriguez asked the question they were all thinking. Did you lose anyone from your squadron? Donovan's expression shifted. The professional pilot's mask slipped just slightly, and beneath it they could see something raw. We lost 2 pilots in Desert Storm, one during a mission over Baghdad. His aircraft took a direct hit from a SAM. He didn't have time to eject. She paused, and her voice dropped lower. The other was my wingman, Captain Michael Torres. We were on our 39th mission together, a radar-guided missile we didn't see coming. He ejected, but he landed in hostile territory. We never recovered him. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient sounds of the academy seemed to fade away. Walsh's voice was barely a whisper. I'm sorry, ma'am. Donovan nodded once, sharp and controlled. So am I. Every day. She straightened up, pulling herself back to the present. But that's the job. That's what we sign up for. Torres knew it. I knew it. Every pilot who strapped into an F-16 with a wild weasel pod knew it. Chen, his voice full of genuine curiosity now rather than shock, asked, Ma'am, what made you become a fighter pilot? Especially back then, when there weren't many women in combat roles. A real smile crossed Donovan's face for the first time, one that reached her eyes. My father. He flew B-17s over Germany in World War II, came home with a chest full of medals and a head full of stories. I grew up watching him look at the sky with this longing, like part of him was still up there. I wanted that. I wanted to fly like he did, serve like he did. Did he see you fly? Rodriguez asked. He came to my pilot training graduation, pinned my wings on himself. Donovan's voice softened. He died 6 months before Desert Storm started, but I like to think he knew. Knew I'd get my chance to serve just like he did. Morrison, who'd been quiet, processing everything, finally spoke again. Ma'am, when you were flying those missions, when you were... He struggled for the right words. How did you handle the fear? It was the question of someone who'd dreamed of combat aviation his whole life, but was just beginning to understand what it actually meant. Donovan looked at him with something like understanding. You don't handle it. You acknowledge it. Fear is information. It tells you to be alert, to check your six, to trust your training. The pilots who scared me were the ones who claimed they weren't afraid. Those were the ones who made mistakes. She pointed to another patch on her jacket, this one near the collar. See this? They all leaned in. It was a small patch, barely 2 inches wide, showing a single star. This was given to me by my squadron commander after my first combat mission. He told me, "Now you're a combat pilot. Now you know what it means." And he was right. Everything before that moment was preparation. Everything after it was real. Park asked, "What happened on that first mission?" Donovan's eyes went distant again, seeing something decades past. "We flew into an area north of Kuwait City that intelligence said had at least 5 active SAM sites. Our job was to find them, get them to light us up and take them out. We found 7, and every single one of them fired at us." She let that sink in. I was so scared I could barely breathe. But I did the job. My wingman did the job. We suppressed 4 of those sites and marked the others for follow-up strikes. And we came home. "Is that when you knew you could do it?" Walsh asked. "No." Donovan shook her head. "I knew I could do it when I got back in the cockpit the next day. That's when I understood. Fear doesn't mean you can't fly. Fear means you respect what you're doing." By now, a small crowd had begun to form at a respectful distance. Other cadets, some officers, drawn by the intensity of the conversation and the sight of 5 third-class cadets completely absorbed by a woman in a flight jacket. A captain approached, a man in his mid-40s with pilot's wings on his chest. He stopped a few feet away, and his eyes went immediately to the patches on Donovan's jacket. His face transformed with recognition. "Colonel Donovan." His voice carried both surprise and deep respect. Donovan turned. "That depends on who's asking." "Captain Jake Stevens, ma'am. I teach air combat tactics here." He came to attention. "I've read your after-action reports. They're required reading in my advanced course. Ma'am, it's an honor." Words spread like electricity through the growing crowd. Whispers carried across the courtyard. Other cadets were pulling out phones, searching names, finding information. Within minutes, everyone within 50 feet knew who was standing in front of them. Chen turned to Captain Stevens. "Sir, you teach about her missions." Stevens nodded, never taking his eyes off Donovan. "The suppression of enemy air defenses operation on February 7th, 1991. Colonel Donovan led a 4-ship flight into the most heavily defended sector of Baghdad's air defense network. They took out 11 SAM sites in a single mission and enabled a major strike package to hit critical targets without a single loss." He looked at the cadets. "It's considered one of the textbook examples of wild weasel operations." Morrison's jaw dropped. "That was you?" Donovan shifted uncomfortably with the attention. "It was a team effort. 4 aircraft, 4 pilots, and about 100 people on the ground making sure we had the intelligence, the weapons, and the support to pull it off." "But you led it," Stevens pressed. "You made the tactical decisions in real time when the situation changed, and half the SAM sites weren't where intelligence said they'd be." "I did my job," Donovan said simply. Rodriguez had pulled out her phone, was reading something quickly. Her face went pale. "Ma'am, it says here you were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for that mission, and a Silver Star for—" She stopped reading, looking up in disbelief. "Ma'am, you have a Silver Star?" Donovan's expression closed off slightly. "That was for a different mission, and I'd rather not talk about it." But Stevens knew. "The rescue mission, March 2nd. Captain, These cadets should know, ma'am. With your permission." Donovan looked at the 5 faces before her, saw the hunger for knowledge mixed with genuine respect. Finally, she nodded once. Stevens turned to the cadets. "On March 2nd, 1991, an F-15E Strike Eagle went down near Basra. 2 crew members ejected behind enemy lines. Colonel Donovan was on a scheduled mission when the call came through. Instead of returning to base, she and her wingman flew combat air patrol over the downed crew for 4 hours, through heavy ground fire and multiple surface-to-air threats, until a rescue helicopter could extract them." He paused for effect. She took 3 separate SAM launches during that time and stayed on station until both crew members were safe. The 5 cadets stared at Donovan with something beyond respect now, something closer to awe. Park's voice shook. "Ma'am, 4 hours? In combat airspace?" "It felt longer," Donovan said quietly. "And before you ask, yes, I'd do it again. Those were 2 American airmen on the ground. You don't leave people behind." Walsh was fighting back tears. She understood, maybe better than the others, what her father had meant about bravery and craziness. This woman had risked everything for 2 people she'd never met. Chen stepped forward. "Mom, why are you here? At the academy?" Donovan glanced at Captain Stevens, who nodded encouragingly. "I was invited. There's a heritage dinner on Friday for Desert Storm veterans. I almost didn't come. I'm not much for ceremonies anymore." But they were persistent. A small smile. "I'm glad now that they were." "Will you speak?" Morrison asked. "At the dinner or to cadets?" "I wasn't planning to." Stevens spoke up quickly. "Ma'am, with your permission, I'd like to change that plan. These cadets need to hear your story, all of them. Not just what I can tell them from reports and recordings. They need to hear it from you." Donovan looked uncertain. "Captain, I'm not a public speaker. I'm just a pilot. Was a pilot." "No, ma'am," Chen said, his voice strong now. "You're exactly what we need to hear from. Not someone reading from a book or showing PowerPoint slides. Someone who actually did it. Someone who can tell us what it really means." The other 4 nodded in agreement, and behind them, the growing crowd of cadets murmured their support. Donovan looked at all those young faces, saw something of herself in them decades ago, eager, uncertain, hungry to prove themselves, not yet understanding the weight of what they were preparing to carry. "What do you want to know?" she asked finally. Chen didn't hesitate. "Everything." The crowd had grown to nearly 40 cadets now, forming a loose semicircle around the low wall where Colonel Sarah Donovan sat. Word had spread through text messages and hurried conversations. A Desert Storm Wild Weasel pilot was here telling her story, and you needed to get to the terrazzo right now. Captain Stevens had made a quick call to the commandant's office, getting permission to postpone evening formation by 30 minutes. This was living history. Donovan had removed her jacket despite the cooling air, laying it across her lap. The patches were visible now to everyone, and several cadets had their phones out, photographing the insignias while trying to remain respectful. Each patch told a story. Each thread held memory. She ran her hand over the worn fabric, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly in the early evening air. "I want to start by telling you about the jacket itself, because every pilot who's worn one knows. It's not just clothing. It's a record." She held up the left sleeve, pointing to a faded patch near the shoulder. "This is from my pilot training class, Class 84-7. I was one of 3 women who graduated. The Air Force was still figuring out what to do with female pilots back then. We could fly trainers, transports, tankers, but combat? That was off limits." Rodriguez raised her hand slightly. "Ma'am, how did you end up flying fighters if combat was restricted?" Donovan smiled grimly. "Congress changed the rules. 1991, right before Desert Storm. They lifted the ban on women in combat aircraft, but I'd already been flying F-16s for 2 years by then, stationed at Hill Air Force Base with the 388th. I'd done everything my male counterparts had done. The training, the qualifications, the weapons certifications. The only thing I couldn't do was fly in actual combat." She paused, her fingers tracing another patch. "And then Iraq invaded Kuwait. Suddenly the rules changed because they needed every qualified pilot they could get." Chen leaned forward. "How did it feel, getting that chance?" "Terrifying," Donovan said immediately. "Not because I didn't think I could do it. I knew I could fly as well as any man in my squadron, but I also knew I'd be under a microscope. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and it wouldn't just reflect on me. It would reflect on every woman trying to break into combat aviation. Walsh understood this in her bones. The pressure to be perfect. Not just perfect, Donovan corrected. Better, because anything less would be used as evidence that women didn't belong. So I made sure I was better. I flew more training sorties, studied more tactics. When we deployed to Saudi Arabia in January of '91, I was ready. She pointed to another patch, this one showing a black widow spider over crossed lightning bolts. The 421st Tactical Fighter Squadron, the Black Widows. Our mission in Desert Storm was SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, wild weasel operations. We flew into the heart of Iraqi air defense networks to find and destroy surface-to-air missile sites. Morrison asked the question on everyone's mind. "Ma'am, why would anyone volunteer for that?" Donovan met his eyes. "Because if we didn't, other pilots would die. Every SAM site we took out meant bomber crews could hit their targets and come home safely. We weren't there for glory. We were there to save lives." She lifted the jacket, showing them the right sleeve where a series of small embroidered tabs ran in a vertical line. "These are mission markers. Each one represents a combat sortie over Iraq or Kuwait. I flew my first combat mission 18 hours after the air campaign started." Park's voice was hushed. "What do you remember about it?" Donovan closed her eyes, and when she spoke, they could all hear that she was back there, seeing it all again. "Everything. I remember the pre-flight briefing at 0300 hours. I remember strapping into the cockpit of my F-16, call sign Viper 23. I remember the weight of the targeting pod and the HARM missiles under my wings. And I remember the fear." She opened her eyes, looking directly at the cadets. "They tell you about fear in training, but nothing really prepares you for the moment when you cross into enemy airspace and you know that people down there are actively trying to kill you." Chen asked quietly, "How did you push through it?" "Training, muscle memory, and clarity. When the threat receiver starts screaming and you see missile launches tracking toward you, there's no time for fear anymore. There's only action. You execute the maneuvers. You employ countermeasures. You do the job." She held up a finger. "But here's what they don't tell you in the classroom. Combat flying isn't about being fearless. It's about being so well-trained that you can function despite the fear. It's about trusting your aircraft, your weapon systems, and most importantly, your wingman." Stevens spoke up. "Colonel, tell them about Captain Torres." Donovan's expression shifted. The crowd went absolutely silent. "My primary wingman was Captain Michael Torres. Mike. He was 28 years old from San Antonio, married with a baby daughter he'd only met once before we deployed. We flew 38 missions together. We learned each other's flying styles so well we could anticipate each other's moves. We saved each other's lives probably a dozen times." Her voice grew quieter. "Mission 39 was over Baghdad. February 28th, the last day of the air war before the ceasefire. We were tasked with hitting a SAM site that had been relocated into a residential area. It was a difficult target, high risk." Donovan's hands tightened on the jacket. "We made our run. I took out the primary radar installation. Mike was covering my 6, and then the warning came too late. A radar-guided missile, probably an SA-6, came from a mobile launcher we didn't know was there. It tracked Mike's aircraft." Rodriguez had tears streaming down her face now. "I saw the hit. His F-16 took the missile in the left engine. The aircraft went into an immediate roll. I called for him to eject, and he did. The chute deployed. He was alive." She took a breath. "But he landed 10 miles inside enemy territory, in an urban area controlled by Republican Guard units. I called in his position, orbited overhead, tried to establish radio contact. Nothing. The rescue helicopters were an hour away. I stayed on station flying combat air patrol, taking ground fire, burning through fuel for 4 hours. 4 hours, Stevens added quietly, because I wasn't leaving him. But the rescue never happened. Iraqi forces reached him first. We got intelligence later that he was captured, injured, but alive. And then nothing. He was listed as missing in action. After the war ended, when POWs were released, Mike wasn't among them. They never found him? Walsh asked, her voice breaking. Donovan shook her head. In 2009, remains were discovered by a UN team investigating mass graves near Baghdad. Forensics confirmed it was Mike. He'd been executed, probably within days of his capture. She looked up at the sky, blinking hard. 18 years. His family waited 18 years for answers. The weight of that hung over the entire crowd. Morrison's voice was thick with emotion. "Ma'am, how do you carry that? You don't have a choice. You carry it because Mike can't. You carry it because his daughter grew up without a father. You carry it because every time you put on this jacket with these patches, you're remembering not just your missions, but his." She pointed to a small patch near the collar, a black widow spider with the name Torres underneath. "I had this made after we recovered his remains. I wear it every time I put this jacket on, so Mike's still my wingman, still flying with me." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd now. Chen's voice was barely audible. "How many other patches are there like that?" Donovan turned the jacket, showing them the interior lining. There, carefully sewn into the fabric, were more than a dozen patches and tabs. Each one carried a name. "These are the people I flew with, the people I served with. Some died in Desert Storm, some died later in training accidents or other conflicts. This jacket isn't just my story, it's their story. It's our story." She pointed to another patch on the exterior, one showing a silver star. "This is from the mission Captain Stevens mentioned, March 2nd. An F-15E crew went down near Basra. My wingman that day was Captain Linda Alvarez. We diverted immediately when we got the emergency call. Both crew members had ejected and were on the ground, evading Iraqi forces, but the extraction helicopters were 90 minutes out." "What did you do?" Walsh asked. "We bought them time. Linda and I ran attack profiles on the Iraqi forces, forcing them to take cover, slowing their advance. We didn't have air-to-ground weapons, but the Iraqis didn't know that. They just saw F-16s making attack runs, and they scattered." Stevens added, "The gun camera footage from that mission is still used in tactical training." "But we started taking missile launches," Donovan continued. "I evaded 3 separate SA-14s. Linda took ground fire that damaged her aircraft, but we held position for 4 hours. At one point I was down to 12 minutes of fuel. I had to make a choice, return to base or stay on station. I chose to stay." "The helicopters made it," Morrison said, almost pleading. "They made it, with about 6 minutes of fuel remaining in my tanks. The Pave Hawk helicopters extracted both crew members under fire. Linda and I escorted them back to friendly airspace, then flew on fumes to the nearest tanker." She smiled slightly. "When I landed, my crew chief counted 18 bullet holes in my aircraft. I hadn't even known I'd been hit." The cadets absorbed this in stunned silence. Chen looked at all the patches again, seeing them differently now. "Ma'am, every one of these has a story like that, doesn't it? Everyone. 43 combat missions. 43 times I flew into harm's way." She touched another patch. "This one is from the night we hit the nuclear facility at Al-Qaim. This one is from the mission where we took out 6 SAM sites in one run." Stevens checked his watch. "Ma'am, would you consider speaking to a larger group? Maybe at the Heritage Dinner on Friday?" Before she could answer, Chen spoke up. "Please, ma'am, we need this, all of us." He gestured to the crowd of cadets. "We study warfare in classrooms. We practice in simulators. But we need to hear from someone who actually did it." The other cadets murmured agreement, 40 voices, all asking the same thing. Donovan looked at their faces, young, eager, hungry for knowledge and meaning. She saw herself in them decades ago. "All right, I'll speak at the dinner, but only if you all promise me something." "Anything, ma'am," Morrison said immediately. "Remember that these patches, these stories, they're not about glory, they're about service, they're about sacrifice, they're about the people who didn't come home." She held up the jacket. "And when you get your own jacket someday, When you earn your own patches, remember what they represent. Not just your accomplishments, but your responsibility to those who come after you. 40 voices responded as one. Yes, ma'am. Interior. Arnold Hall. Ballroom. Friday evening. The ballroom was packed. Every seat at every table was filled, and cadets lined the walls 3 deep, standing at attention in their dress blues. The chandeliers cast warm light across the room, glinting off polished brass and silver. American flags stood at attention on either side of the stage, and the Air Force seal hung prominent on the wall behind the podium. This was supposed to be a routine heritage dinner, a handful of Desert Storm veterans sharing memories with cadets over chicken and potatoes. Then everyone would go home. But word had spread about Colonel Sarah Donovan, about her story, about the patches on her jacket. By Wednesday, every cadet on base knew her name. By Thursday, the commandant had restructured the entire evening around her. Now she sat at the head table, looking uncomfortable in a navy blue dress, her flight jacket draped over the back of her chair like a guardian. Beside her sat Major General Patricia Howard, the commandant of cadets, and on her other side Captain Stevens, who'd orchestrated this entire evening. Chen, Morrison, Rodriguez, Park, and Walsh sat together at a table near the front, their dress uniforms immaculate, their faces showing a mixture of pride and anticipation. They'd spent the last 3 days telling everyone who would listen about their encounter on the terrazzo. They'd become minor celebrities themselves, the cadets who'd discovered the legend. General Howard stood and approached the podium. The room fell silent instantly. Cadets, distinguished guests, fellow veterans, she began, her voice carrying authority earned through 3 decades of service. Tonight, we gather to honor those who served in Operation Desert Storm. That conflict, though brief, demonstrated the professionalism, courage, and technological superiority of American air power. Many of the tactics and procedures we use today were forged in the skies over Iraq and Kuwait. She paused, letting that sink in. But sometimes, the most important lessons aren't found in after-action reports or tactical manuals. Sometimes they're carried in the memories of those who were there, who faced the enemy, who made the hard choices, who paid the price. Howard turned toward Donovan, who sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. Colonel Sarah Donovan flew 43 combat missions in Desert Storm. She was one of the first women to fly combat sorties in American military history. She flew Wild Weasel missions, deliberately drawing enemy fire to protect other pilots. She was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Silver Star, and the Purple Heart. Her tactical innovations in SEAD operations are still taught at every fighter weapons school in the Air Force. The room erupted in applause. Donovan stood reluctantly, gave a small nod, and sat back down quickly. She looked like she wanted to disappear. Howard smiled. Colonel Donovan is also someone who, just a few days ago, was stopped by 5 cadets who noticed the patches on her jacket. Those cadets, Cadet Chen, Cadet Morrison, Cadet Rodriguez, Cadet Park, and Cadet Walsh, showed exactly the kind of awareness and respect we try to instill in every officer. They looked closer, they asked questions, they listened, and what they learned changed their perspective on service. She gestured to the 5 cadets, who stood at their table, suddenly self-conscious as hundreds of eyes turned toward them. Tonight, Colonel Donovan has agreed to share her story with all of us, not from a podium reading prepared remarks, but the way she shared it on Tuesday, honestly, directly, and from the heart. Howard stepped aside. Colonel Donovan. The applause was thunderous now. 300 cadets, dozens of officers, and a room full of veterans, all standing, all showing their respect. Donovan walked to the podium slowly, carrying her jacket. She draped it over the podium's edge, the patches visible to everyone in the front rows. She looked out at the sea of faces and took a deep breath. "I'm not good at speeches," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor of nervousness underneath. "I'm a pilot. I'm used to communicating in brief radio calls and hand signals. So I'm going to talk to you the way I'd talk to my squadron. Direct, honest, no sugar-coating. She picked up the jacket, held it up so the whole room could see. "This jacket is 34 years old. I've had it longer than some of you have been alive. And every patch, every mark, every worn spot tells a story. Tonight I want to tell you some of those stories. Not because they're about me, but because they're about what service really means." She pointed to the wild weasel patch. "This insignia represents the most dangerous job in combat aviation. Wild weasel pilots deliberately fly into enemy air defenses to draw fire. We make ourselves targets, so intelligence can locate the SAM sites and we can destroy them. The motto of Wild Weasel is, first in, last out. We're the first aircraft into hostile airspace and the last ones to leave." Her voice grew stronger now, more confident. "When I volunteered for Wild Weasel training, people asked if I was crazy. Maybe I was. But I understood something important. Someone had to do this job. Someone had to be willing to fly into the teeth of the enemy's defenses, and I wanted to be that someone." She looked directly at the cadets in the front rows. "Because that's what service is. It's not about choosing the safe path or the easy mission. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when it's terrifying." Donovan touched another patch, her fingers lingering on it. "This is my squadron patch, the 421st Tactical Fighter Squadron, the Black Widows. We deployed to Al-Kaj Air Base in Saudi Arabia on January 5, 1991. 12 days later, the air war started. And for the next 6 weeks we flew constantly, sometimes 2 missions a day, sometimes at night, sometimes at dawn, always into the most heavily defended areas." She paused, and the room was so quiet that the only sound was the air conditioning humming overhead. "I want to tell you about one mission in particular. February 7th, we'd been at war for 3 weeks. Intelligence reported a heavily fortified SAM network protecting strategic targets in downtown Baghdad. Previous strikes had been turned back because the air defenses were too strong. Our job was to clear a path." She closed her eyes, remembering. "I led a 4-ship flight. My wingman was Captain Torres. We crossed into Iraqi airspace at dawn, flying low to avoid radar detection. When we reached the target area, we climbed to altitude and turned on our targeting systems. And immediately, everything lit up. The threat receiver was screaming. Missile launches from multiple sites. The sky was full of tracers and SAM trails. Morrison was leaning forward so far he was nearly out of his seat. We went to work. We had HARM anti-radiation missiles. They home in on radar emissions. Each aircraft carried 3. Our job was to fire, evade, acquire new targets, fire again. For 20 minutes, we were in constant combat, evading missiles, launching weapons, trying to stay alive while destroying the enemy's defenses." Her voice dropped lower. "At one point, I had 2 SA-6 missiles tracking me simultaneously. I put the aircraft into a dive, released chaff and flares, pulled 9 Gs coming out of the maneuver. The missiles detonated close enough that shrapnel hit my aircraft. But I stayed in the fight. We all did, because 11 other aircraft were depending on us to clear that airspace." She opened her eyes, looked around the room. "We destroyed 11 SAM sites that morning. 11. The strike package that came behind us hit every single target without taking a loss. That's why we did what we did, not for medals or recognition, but so other pilots could complete their missions and go home to their families." The applause started to build, but she raised a hand, stopping it. "But I need to tell you the cost." Her voice cracked slightly. 3 weeks later, my wingman, Mike Torres, was shot down. I watched his aircraft take a hit. I watched him eject. I orbited overhead for 4 hours, trying to protect him until rescue could arrive, but it never came. Iraqi forces captured him, and he never came home. She pulled out the small patch with Torres's name on it. "This is Mike. He was 28 years old. His daughter was 6 months old when we deployed. She never really knew her father. And 18 years later, when they finally found his remains, she was in college, studying to be a pilot herself." Tears were flowing freely now throughout the room. Even General Howard was wiping her eyes. "So when you look at these patches, When you see the mission markers and the combat badges, remember, each one came with a price. Some paid with their lives, some paid with injuries that never fully healed. Some paid with memories that wake them up at night 30 years later. She looked at Chen, Morrison, Rodriguez, Park, and Walsh. Those 5 cadets asked me on Tuesday what it means to serve. This is what it means. It means being willing to pay the price. It means putting others before yourself. It means carrying the memory of those who didn't come home and honoring their sacrifice every single day. Donovan held up the jacket one more time. When you graduate from this academy, when you earn your wings, when you get your first assignment, remember this: the uniform you wear, the aircraft you fly, the missions you execute, they all rest on the shoulders of those who came before you. People like Mike Torres, people like the 12 names sewn into the lining of this jacket, people who gave everything. Her voice grew stronger, more forceful. And when you face your moment, because you will face your moment, when you have to make the hard choice, when you have to fly into danger, when you have to decide between the easy path and the right path, think about these patches. Think about the people they represent. Think about the standard they set. She looked around the room, making eye contact with as many cadets as she could. You are the future of American air power. You will face threats I can't imagine, fly aircraft that didn't exist when I was in the cockpit, fight wars that haven't been conceived yet. But the core truth remains the same. Service requires sacrifice. Excellence requires dedication. And honor requires that you never forget those who paved the way. Donovan stepped back from the podium, her message delivered. For a moment, the room was silent. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet, applauding, some cheering, many crying openly. She stood there, this woman in her 50s, who'd flown into hell and back, holding a worn flight jacket covered in the memories of a war fought decades ago. And she received the gratitude of 300 future officers who finally understood what the patches really meant. General Howard returned to the podium, waiting for the applause to subside. Colonel Donovan, on behalf of the United States Air Force Academy, I want to thank you, not just for your service during Desert Storm, but for what you've given these cadets tonight, the truth about service. She pulled out a blue box from beneath the podium. We'd like to present you with something, a small token of our appreciation and respect. She opened the box, revealing a glass-encased display. Inside was an academy patch, a silver pilot's wings pin, and an engraved plaque that read, Colonel Sarah Donovan, 421st TFS, Desert Storm. First in, last out. Never forgotten. Donovan's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as she accepted the display, clutching it to her chest. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for remembering. The sun was just breaking over the Rampart Range on Saturday morning, painting the eastern sky in shades of amber and gold. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and jet fuel. On the flight line, a row of T-38 Talons sat gleaming in the early light, their white and orange paint schemes bright against the dark tarmac. Colonel Sarah Donovan stood near the fence line, her flight jacket zipped against the morning chill, watching as cadets performed their pre-flight checks. She'd been invited back this morning by Captain Stevens, who'd arranged something special, something he said she needed to see. Behind her, a small group had gathered. Chen, Morrison, Rodriguez, Park and Walsh, along with about 20 other cadets who'd heard about the dawn visit. General Howard was there too, along with several instructors and a handful of the Desert Storm veterans who'd attended Friday's dinner. Stevens approached, accompanied by a young woman in a flight suit. She couldn't have been more than 23, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her face showing a mixture of nervousness and determination. Colonel Donovan, Stevens said, I'd like you to meet Cadet First Class Maria Torres. Donovan's breath caught. She stared at the young woman, seeing features she recognized, the dark eyes, the determined set of the jaw. The way she stood, weight slightly forward, ready. Torres, Donovan whispered, you're Mike's daughter. Yes, ma'am, Maria said, her voice steady, despite the emotion clearly visible on her face. I'm Mike Torres's daughter. For a moment, neither woman could speak. Then Donovan stepped forward and wrapped the young cadet in a fierce embrace. Maria hugged her back, and both women were crying. He would be so proud, Donovan said, pulling back to look at Maria's face. So incredibly proud. You're a pilot? I got my wings last month, ma'am. I'm heading to fighter training at Shepherd next week. Maria's voice was thick with emotion. I've wanted to meet you for so long. When I heard you were here, I had to be here. Donovan touched Maria's face gently. You look like him. You have his eyes, his determination. My mom says I have his stubborn streak too, Maria said, smiling through her tears. She told me stories about you, about how you stayed overhead when he went down, about how you tried everything to bring him home. She wanted me to thank you for not giving up, for honoring him. I think about him every day, Donovan said quietly. Every single day. And Maria reached into her flight suit pocket and pulled out a patch. It was worn and faded, the edges frayed. A black widow spider over-crossed lightning bolts. The 421st Squadron patch. This was his. They sent it back to us with his personal effects when they finally recovered his remains. My mom kept it all these years. She wanted you to have it. Maria pressed the patch into Donovan's hand. She said you were his wingman, that you should carry a piece of him with you. Donovan's hand closed around the patch, and she couldn't stop the tears now. Thank you. Tell your mother that Mike was the best wingman I ever flew with. Tell her that I'm sorry, that I tried. She knows, ma'am. She's always known. And she doesn't blame you. None of us do. Maria's voice was firm. You gave him 4 more hours. 4 more hours of hope. That matters. Stevens stepped forward gently. Colonel, there's something else. Maria requested special permission for her first solo flight in the T-38 to be this morning, and she asked if you'd be here to watch. Donovan looked at Maria in wonder. Your first solo? Yes, ma'am. I wanted you to be here because you were there for my dad's last flight. I wanted you here for one of my first. To complete the circle. The small crowd that had gathered was utterly silent, bearing witness to this moment. General Howard spoke up quietly. Colonel Donovan, we've also arranged for you to participate in Maria's pre-flight brief, if you're willing. I'd be honored, Donovan said, her voice barely above a whisper. They moved to the briefing room where Maria outlined her flight plan with the precision of someone who'd practiced it 100 times. She detailed her route, her altitude changes, her radio check-in points, her emergency procedures. Donovan sat in the front row, watching intently, occasionally nodding. The other cadets filled the remaining seats, along with instructors and the visiting veterans. This was more than a pre-flight brief. This was a ceremony. When Maria finished, she paused and looked at Donovan. Ma'am, Captain Stevens said you might have some words for me before I fly. Donovan stood slowly and walked to the front of the room. She faced Maria directly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 3 decades of experience. Your father taught me something important about being a wingman. He taught me that trust isn't just about flying formation. It's about knowing that the person beside you will do whatever it takes to bring you home. He did that for me dozens of times. And when he needed me to do the same for him, I tried. I failed to bring him home alive, but I never stopped trying. That's what wingmen do. She stepped closer to Maria. Today, you're flying solo. You won't have a wingman up there with you, but you're not alone. Your father flies with you. Every pilot who came before you flies with you. The training, the values, the dedication they showed, it's all there in your preparation, in your skills, in your heart. Donovan reached up and unpinned something from her flight jacket. It was a small silver pin, worn smooth from decades of handling, a pair of pilot's wings, the same style worn by combat pilots in Desert Storm. These were mine. I wore them on every combat mission I flew. I want you to have them now. Not as a good luck charm. Pilots make their own luck through training and discipline, but as a reminder that you're part of a legacy. You carry your father's name, and you carry the responsibility that comes with it. Fly well, fly safe, and come home. She pinned the wings to Maria's flight suit, right above her name tag. Maria stood at attention, tears streaming down her face, but her voice was strong when she spoke. "Thank you, Mom. I'll honor them. I'll honor him." They saluted each other, sharp and precise. Then Donovan pulled Maria into another embrace. "Your dad would have loved seeing this moment," Donovan whispered. "He's watching. I know he is." Back on the flight line, Maria walked toward her T-38, conducting her external inspection with practiced efficiency. She checked the control surfaces, verified the fuel ports, examined the landing gear. Every movement was purposeful, professional. Donovan stood with the gathered crowd, watching. Chen stood beside her, and he spoke quietly. "Ma'am, watching this, seeing her prepare to fly, it makes everything you told us real. The legacy, the responsibility, the connection between generations." Donovan nodded. "That's what these patches represent. That's what this jacket means. It's not about the past, it's about the future. Every pilot who came before you paved the way for the ones who come after. Maria is flying today because her father flew, because I flew, because thousands of others flew and fought and sometimes died so that the next generation could have the opportunity to serve." Morrison spoke up, his voice humble now. "Ma'am, I understand now why you wear that jacket, why you keep those patches. They're not decorations. They're responsibilities." "Yes," Donovan said simply. "That's exactly what they are." Maria climbed the ladder into the T-38's cockpit. They watched as she strapped in, conducted her interior checks, began the engine start sequence. The twin turbojets spooled up with a rising whine, and the aircraft trembled with barely contained power. Rodriguez wiped her eyes. "This is beautiful. This moment, it's everything military service should be." Maria taxied out slowly, her movements smooth and confident. She reached the end of the runway, performed her final checks, and received clearance from the tower. The T-38 rolled forward, gaining speed, the engines building to full power. The nose lifted, the main gear left the ground, and Maria Torres, daughter of Captain Michael Torres, was airborne. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Donovan watched the aircraft climb into the morning sky, her hand raised in an informal salute. The T-38 banked gracefully to the east, catching the sunlight, becoming a bright spot against the deep blue of the Colorado sky. Walsh stood beside Donovan now, watching the aircraft disappear into the distance. "Ma'am, do you think we're ready? All of us cadets. Do you think we understand what we're getting into?" Donovan considered the question carefully. "No, you can't truly understand until you're there, until you're strapped into the cockpit heading into harm's way. But that's not the point. The point is that you're willing to try. You're willing to learn, you're willing to serve, and you're willing to ask questions, to listen, to learn from those who came before you. That's what gives me hope." 1 hour later, Maria's T-38 appeared again, a small speck growing larger as it approached the airfield. She entered the pattern smoothly, descended on a perfect glide slope, and touched down with barely a chirp of the tires. A flawless landing. When she climbed down from the cockpit, the crowd was waiting. She walked toward them with the unmistakable swagger of a pilot who'd just nailed a solo flight, and her face showed pure joy. Donovan met her halfway, and they embraced again. "How was it?" Donovan asked. "Perfect," Maria said. "Absolutely perfect. And ma'am, I felt him up there. My dad, I felt him flying with me." "He was," Donovan said with certainty. "He absolutely was." The 5 cadets who'd started this journey on Tuesday gathered around. Chen spoke for all of them. "Colonel Donovan, would you sign our flight caps? So we carry a piece of this lesson with us." Donovan looked surprised, but after a moment she nodded. "All right, but on one condition. When you sign your name, you also write one word next to it, the word that matters most to you about service." One by one they handed her their flight caps, and she signed each one carefully. Then they added their own words. Chen wrote, "Honor." Morrison wrote, "Sacrifice." Rodriguez wrote, "Courage." Park wrote, "Dedication." Walsh wrote, "Legacy." Stevens approached with a large framed photograph showing Donovan on stage holding her jacket. Around the edges, over 100 cadets had signed their names with messages. "Thank you for your service. You inspire us. We'll carry the legacy forward. Never forgotten." Donovan held the photograph, reading the messages, and couldn't speak for a long moment. Finally, she found her voice. "Thank you, all of you. This week has meant more to me than you can possibly know. I came here thinking I'd just attend a dinner, maybe tell a few stories. Instead, I found hope. Hope that the Air Force is in good hands. Hope that the legacy continues. Hope that the sacrifices made by people like Mike Torres won't be forgotten." She held up her jacket one last time, the morning sun illuminating every patch, every worn spot, every thread of memory. When you get your own jackets, when you start earning your own patches, remember this moment. Remember that each patch comes with responsibility. Each mission comes with meaning. Each flight connects you to everyone who flew before you and everyone who will fly after you. You're not just pilots. You're guardians of a legacy that stretches back over a century. Her voice grew stronger. So fly well. Fly with honor. Take care of your wingman. Come home safely. And when your time comes to pass the torch to the next generation, make sure they understand what you learned here. That service isn't about glory or medals. It's about sacrifice. It's about doing what's necessary even when it's hard. It's about being worthy of the uniform you wear and the patches you earn. And most importantly, never forget the people who didn't come home. Carry their names. Honor their sacrifice. Make sure their service meant something by serving with excellence yourself. That's how we keep them alive. That's how we honor their memory. That's how we ensure that the legacy continues. She started to walk toward the parking lot, but Chen called out, "Ma'am, wait!" All of the cadets had come to attention and rendered a salute, sharp, precise, and full of genuine respect. Donovan stood still for a moment, then returned the salute with equal precision. A final exchange of respect between generations. As she walked away, Maria Torres fell into step beside her. "Ma'am, I'm heading to my mother's house for the weekend. Would you like to come? She'd love to meet you, to thank you in person." Donovan stopped walking. She looked at this young woman who carried her father's name and his determination, and she smiled. "I would be honored, truly honored." They walked together toward the parking lot, past the row of gleaming aircraft, under the vast Colorado sky. Behind them, the cadets dispersed to their duties, but they carried something new with them now. They carried understanding. They carried purpose. They carried the legacy forward. And on the flight line, in the morning sunshine, the sound of jet engines continued. The sound of America's Air Force, training the next generation of pilots who would defend freedom, honor the fallen, and add their own patches to their own jackets someday. The legacy lived on. If you've heard this story, if these words have touched your heart, then you understand something important. Service isn't just for those who wear the uniform. Service is for all of us. It's about honoring those who sacrifice. It's about remembering their names. It's about teaching the next generation what it truly means to serve with honor, courage, and dedication. Take a moment today to thank a veteran. Ask them about their service, listen to their stories, and never let their sacrifices be forgotten. Because every patch tells a story, every uniform carries a legacy, and every generation has the responsibility to pass that legacy forward with honor. God bless our service members. God bless those who gave all. And God bless America.